Welcome to the third conversation in this series, Public Sociology Live. This is an experimental course that is a collaboration between the International Sociological Association, the University of California, Berkeley, and a whole range of universities and sociological institutions throughout the world. I'm Lale Bebohanyan, and I have the great privilege of teaching this course with Michael Burawoy, who's right here. As well as many students, both those here with us today, as well as those who are virtually connected to us throughout the world. And our guest today is Dr. Nandini Sundar, who is joining us live right now from Delhi, where it's almost midnight. And Dr. Sundar is our third guest in this series. We began first with our own, Michael Burawoy, who offered us a framework for thinking about public sociology. As first and foremost sociology that is addressed to, accessible to, and engages with broader publics beyond academia. And this first conversation raised a whole series of questions for us about the possibilities of public sociology, the forms it may take in different parts of the world, the possibilities of engaging with different kinds of publics, but also some of the challenges that public sociologists face, perhaps in relation to the publics that they work with, but also in relation to the larger field of sociology. So we raised a lot of questions, but we had an initial framework to begin with, and then we moved on to a conversation with Dr. Manuel Castells, who offered us his theory of the power of communication in what he calls a network society. And so we thought about his theory and its implications for public sociology, how publics perhaps could be thought of as networks, the possibilities of publics and of public sociologists effectively connecting and communicating through these networks, and some of the challenges that could be faced in terms of thinking about public sociology as connecting networks of publics. But so far, our discussions have been generally abstract. We've been engaging with theories that have implications for public sociology. But today, we actually turn to a very concrete example of public sociologists and a scholar who, for us in many ways, epitomizes what we imagine a public sociologist's work would look like, Dr. Nandini Sundar, who is the chair of is a professor and chair of the Department of Sociology at the Delhi School of Economics. She's written extensively, many books and academic articles, including Subalterns and Sovereigns, an anthropological history of Bastar. She has served as the co-editor of the journal Contributions to Indian Sociology, along with Dr. Amita Bhaviskar, along with whom she was awarded, actually, the Infosys Prize for Social Science. And she's done a great deal of research particularly on subaltern political movements, specifically among indigenous and tribal communities in India. But she's worked on issues relating to state counterinsurgency, violence, citizenship, and a whole range of struggles over land and resources. But in addition to all of this academic work, she's also spent many, many years engaged in forms of activism, advocacy, and what we would like to think of as public sociology, where she's been very directly engaged with indigenous Adivasi communities, particularly in Chhattisgarh, which we're hoping that she'll speak about a bit today with us. So first of all, please join me in welcoming Dr. Nandini Sundar. Thank you so much for joining us. And Dr. Sundar, so we'd like for you actually maybe to begin by speaking with us for maybe 15 or so minutes about your work, specifically in Chhattisgarh, and then we'd like to open it up after that for some discussion.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael and Lale, for asking me to be part of this. I'm tremendously excited by being networked to so many people across the globe, and it's also interesting to think of how what one is working on might be received in these very different paths and how it might translate into other people's experiences. Can you hear me, or yeah, Michael's looking a bit...
Quite well.
Great.
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yep.
Yes,
Yeah?
that's great.
Even though you're in Delhi, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, great. So let me just talk about what I've been working on in the last few years, which is a counter-insurgency campaign that's been going on in central India against what in India are called Naxalites, but elsewhere are called Maoist guerrillas. So this was a movement which began, in the 1940s actually, and has had periodic resurrections, and mostly has been to do with questions of land and wages for people who are at the bottom of the agrarian structure. So in the late 1960s, early 70s, there was a sort of major upsurge of the Naxalite movement across different parts of India, particularly in Bengal, in southern India. And that's where the name Naxalite comes from, because it came from from an area called Naxalbari, which was a tea gardenist, area. And the laborers on that tea garden then took to armed struggle, and that's how, the whole movement got its name. So there was a long period when the movement was suppressed, and from the 70s, they were subjected to brutal state repression, and but pockets continued. And then since about 2004, when several different parties came together to form the Communist Party of India, Maoist, the movement has really become strong. It's spread across several states in India. And the government the Prime Minister has repeatedly described it as the biggest security threat that the country is facing. So since about 2004, the government has invested huge amounts of money, paramilitary forces into suppressing this movement. And in 2009, they started what they called Operation Green Hunt, which was basically to flush out the Maoists across, the several different states that they're active in. Now, the issues that the Maoists have taken up have mostly been, as I said, questions of land rights for people who didn't have access to land. And given that, despite the move towards urbanization, industrialization, the majority of the Indian population is still rural, land is a big issue. And land reforms have been one of the big unfinished agendas of the independence movement. They've been a potent issue. And they've become even more important now with a lot of forcible land acquisition for industrialization due to neoliberalism. So land has always been an important issue, and it's become an important issue now in a double sense, both in terms of land reform, which was unfinished, and in terms of protecting whatever land people do have from forcible acquisition for mining and for large industry. So that's been one issue. Then questions of forest rights and so on. Again, all of these go back to India's colonial legacy, when the British set in place laws to do with the forest, to do with land, and to do with policing, which severely disadvantaged indigenous people and lower castes. And so since about 1980, in this particular part of central India, the Maoists have been active. They've established kind of village level committees in across a very large area. And we're talking, the area that I've been working on is part of the state of Chhattisgarh. Am I going too fast? Is this?
No. It's perfect, yes.
Yeah. So it's about, the whole area is about 39,000 square kilometers, which is sort of, slightly larger than Belgium. So it's a huge area in the middle of India, heavily forested. About 80% of the population comes from indigenous communities. There's been very little state presence in the sense of schooling or healthcare. And whatever little state presence there has been mostly repressive, so police stations so the Maoists have actually, established themselves pretty strongly in this area, and it's considered one of their strongholds since about the 80s. And from 2004 onwards, the government started this, because the CPI Maoist was formed, because the mining policy had also become liberalized, and all these areas are extremely mining rich. They have India's best reserves of coal, iron, bauxite, diamonds. So this is your classic case of a rich area, poor people. And what the government has been doing has been supported by industry. They really want to get rid of the Maoists in these areas so that they can go in and mine and have access to this land for both industry and to access the forests which the area has. So in 2005, they started the government sponsored what it called a people's movement. And one of the questions that I'm concerned with is how something like this can happen in a democracy, and when it happens in a democracy, the kind of labeling that it requires, because you can't call this emergency, you can't call it regrouping in the way that you could, under a military regime. So in 2005, the government started what it, kept insisting was a spontaneous people's movement, but we have a lot of evidence to show that it was planned by the government, it was sponsored in terms of money and logistical support. And what they did was tell people that they had to come to meetings, and they identified villages which were considered Maoist strongholds, forced people from other villages to come and to meetings, and then went on processions to attack these Maoist strongholds. So this was a classic case of, strategic hamleting, something that has been done in counterinsurgency operations across the world, which is targeting areas which are seen as strongholds of the insurgents, burning them, forcing people to leave their villages and come to live in camps which are controlled by the security forces. So the whole idea is to what is called draining the fish of the sea. So, the idea is that if people are in the villages, they support, the rebels, and with food, with material support of shelter, information. So if you get the people out of the area, then you're leaving only the rebel forces in there. And so, that's the sort of basic principle of strategic hamleting. And this was something that was developed in, has been written about a lot in the context of Malaya during the emergency there between 1948 and 1960. And then it was tried again in Vietnam. And it's been done a lot in counterinsurgency operations across the world. So even in Latin America or Kenya or wherever you have, the government wanting to defeat. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. Yes.
Yeah. This is, a common strategy, this strategic hamleting. So what they did in Chhattisgarh was to do strategic hamleting, but through the mechanism of a so-called people's movement. So all these villagers who went and attacked other villages were threatened that if they didn't participate in this movement, they would be fined, their villages would be burnt. And so many of them were forced to come and live in camps. Entire villages were burnt. According to official statistics, about 644 villages were affected, which is a population of about 100,000 people. So you had about 50,000 people who were forced to come and live in camps under complete surveillance by the government and by the police. And then you had another 50,000 who were sort of living in the forests around their village because the village had been burnt. So every time the security forces attacked, they would flee into the forests. And then you have another, 30, 40,000 who migrated to neighboring states because of the violence. So there was that kind of forcible evacuation of people. There were lots of rapes and killings. People were just killed. Their bodies were left in the villages. Lots of sexual violence, and again. Also starvation. Starvation is quite a common weapon in counterinsurgency, sort of burning people's granaries so that they will not be able to supply any food to the insurgents. Also, that they'll be forced to come and side with the government because they have no food. So all these policies, regrouping, burning villages, the creation of home guards. Now that was another aspect which was, that's common to counterinsurgency across the world. And here what they did was, out of these villagers who were forced to come and live in camps, they appointed some of them as special police officers. So you have these young kids who were given guns, and once they got guns, it's sort of the machismo of having guns and the power to go and attack other people. So these kids then became kind of agents of the state, and many of them had actually been either sympathizers of the Maoists earlier or actual Maoists who were forced to surrender. So because they had betrayed their former comrades, they were sometimes the most vicious turning against the villagers, burning them and killing them. So you have this whole cadre of people, the home, what are called home guards or civil patrols, or here special police officers, who then act as unaccountable agents to whom violence is outsourced. So you have regrouping, burning of villages, the creation of civil patrols, murders and rapes, displacement on a massive scale. And all of this is a common feature of counterinsurgency. You find it across the globe wherever you have these kinds of movements. But in addition to that, what this particular Salvajado movement shared with, it also had a lot in common with other Indian pogroms which have happened against minority, people of minority religion. So you had this major genocidal massacre which happened in Delhi in 1984, when the Prime Minister was killed, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and because she was killed by her Sikh bodyguards, a huge, like 3,000-4,000 Sikhs were killed, in Delhi and in other cities by the ruling party. You had the same kind of thing happening in Gujarat in 2002, when Muslims were killed on a large scale. And what both these incidents and Salvajadum share is the creation of a mechanism for impunity, where the government can get away without anybody being held accountable, because ordinary law is incapable of taking care of mass crimes. And in India, we don't have laws yet which deal with situations of command responsibility for mass crimes. The way that people are being tried, in the international criminal courts for their responsibility for not just their direct involvement in a particular crime, but for actually directing it, being responsible for inaction in protecting people's lives. So that's one thing that this particular counterinsurgency operation shared with other major incidents where the Indian state has been involved in violence against its own citizens, not just in the context of what is called left-wing extremism, but even in the context of targeting minorities. What is also something that is increasingly becoming common in various kinds of violence incidents in India is the support that the government provides to vigilante movements, the kind of deliberate outsourcing of law and order in order to escape accountability. And it's what the Indian state is really setting up, and which is increasingly one finds in a number of places, is the sort of development of public-private partnerships in maintaining a certain sense of law and order, which is really about creating insecurity in people. So it's a security policy which is about the deliberate creation of insecurity among the public at large, because there is no one agency that you can hold accountable or that you can pinpoint. So you have, as in, neoliberal public-private partnerships, a whole variety of agendas which are fulfilled through this kind of partnership. And the main objective is really to escape accountability in this case, and to outsource kinds of violence which the state would not legitimately be able to perform itself. So there's a sharing of sovereignty, but a kind of deliberate outsourcing as well to certain people. So that's one question that I've been looking at, how sovereignty is disputed, not just by the idea of vigilantism, but also by the parallel states that the Maoists run or that other insurgent groups run. I mean, there are large parts of India which are not really under the control of the Indian state in terms of their writ in an everyday sense. You know, in Chhattisgarh, for instance, the Maoists decide any number of things. I mean, they decide if a market will be held, they decide if, you know, when village festivals are to be held, they decide, I mean, they're basically running a parallel state. And to some extent, this has been strengthened by the fact that the government, it's been strengthened by this strategic hamleting, because what the government in effect did when they moved people out of the area, including school teachers, health workers, etc., is to give over this whole area to the Maoists. So in fact, what the government has done is to start to strengthen its enemy. And what's interesting is the way that both sides are authoring the other's actions. And that's, again, something that I'm interested in, the way that not only is sovereignty disputed, but the legitimacy and the authority by which government is run is not only coming from the government, but through emulation of the other side. So the Maoists are behaving like the state is behaving like an outlaw. You know, it's all completely, the source of inspiration and action comes from the other. It's this kind of dialectic of action that's happening. So in 2000, because this was an area that I'd done my PhD on, and I've been, I started working there in 1990, and I've been going back ever since. In 2005, when I found this was going on, I was completely horrified. You know, it was people that I'd seen, you know, kids like this that I'd seen grow up, the idea that they were, you know, using guns and going around terrorizing other people's villages, or that their villages were being burnt. So I was part of a couple of fact findings. In India, there's this whole tradition among civil society organizations of coming to, you know, either established groups or citizens coming together when some incident like this happens to find what actually happened, to present a more truthful version of events. So it's actually quite an interesting way in which people across the country are drawn into each other's problems through this mechanism of a fact-finding or public tribunals where people come and give their testimonies. So I was part of these two fact findings in Chhattisgarh, and then in 2007 we filed what in the US would be called a class action suit. In India, it's called a public interest litigation, where you don't have to be directly involved in something. You can act on behalf of somebody else because it's in the public interest. So you don't have to have sort of personal locus in that. So we filed this case in 2007, and we gave them a list of about 500 people killed and, you know, 100 rapes, 200 testimonies, etc. And that case has been going on since 2007. And the judges have been pretty sympathetic. They've been more or less, you know, they've accepted what we've said. And in 2005, we got this brilliant judgment, which basically said it was unconstitutional to use vigilante groups in counterinsurgency. It was unconstitutional to use hire local youth as special police officers. And it also directed the government to, so it was actually a major intervention in counterinsurgency operations and in the constitutionality of the way that counterinsurgency operations are conducted. And it has, again, implications for other countries as well, where you have the use of similar paramilitary forces or vigilantes. But what the government has done is basically form an auxiliary force that has overturned the judgment. So it's basically in contempt of the Supreme Court now. And we're trying to sort of battle the government's just sheer refusal to follow the law. So there's very little you can do if, what we can do is sort of go to the Supreme Court and say, that they're in contempt and the court should do something about it, but it's kind of long and tortuous process. And in the meantime, the government is getting away with just doing nothing and intensifying the number of paramilitary forces that it has in the area. And it's going to be a long and protracted war. There are combing operations going on. There are helicopters droning overhead. People are randomly getting arrested. So, one of the things that's kind of worrying is just this sort of sheer breakdown of all institutional mechanisms to deal with questions of justice. And what we've been trying to say all along is that the main issue is justice. It's not about development. The government is also trying to pump in huge amounts of money to sort of say, we can solve the problem by giving people money to engage in development work. But really, that's not the issue, because that's not addressing the roots of the insurgency, or not addressing the government's own failures and its deliberate acts of commission in killing people. So should I stop at that? And
thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Sundar. So Nandini, we actually were hoping we have many questions for you, but perhaps maybe the students can begin with any questions anyone has that are just kind of clarifications about the situation in Chhattisgarh or in India more generally that was spoken about. Parijat?
Introduce yourself. Yeah.
So I'm Parijat, and so you discussed the construction of the Naxalites as insurgents and a security threat, but I was wondering, what is your assessment of them?
okay. Do you want to take questions one by one, or several together?
No, one by one.
How about one by one?
One by one?
Individually? Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think there's certainly a security threat to the Indian state. One can't escape the fact that they have a liberation, People's Liberation, PLGA, People's Liberation Guerrilla Army, that they have fairly sophisticated weaponry, IEDs. They've been involved in, blasting transformers, buses, all sorts of things. So definite, and police stations, killing a large number of police. So certainly they are a military threat, but I think there's a huge amount of hype in exactly how much of a military threat they constitute, because certainly if you look at the numbers involved, if you look at the kind of weaponry involved, most of it is looted from police stations, and it certainly doesn't justify the kind of security expenditure and the recruitment of paramilitary forces that the government is engaging in. So all of this could actually be addressed much better through dialogue and peace talks rather than through a military approach. I also don't think that the issue is so much that they're a military threat, but that they're a serious threat to the status quo. So that's really where the threat is coming from.
So any other kind of clarification questions? So I think you've done a beautiful job laying out the situation for us. And Nandini, we actually had the privilege of getting to read a number of your pieces, both some stuff that you've written for academic audiences, but also some interviews, for example, meant for a broader audience. And obviously our focus in this course is really on public sociology. So I know many of the students have questions for you that are coming from that angle, thinking about your work as a form of public sociology. But maybe before we do that, if you could let us know if and how you see yourself as a public sociologist, or some of your work as forms of public sociology.
I think in the past few years, I've been so busy being public with my work that I'm worried about the sociology part of it, because really I've been writing for not that much for a sociological audience as for, writing for the papers, talking to security experts, activists, students, from other disciplines. So really trying to get my views across to a wider audience than I would through my sociological writing. But what I'm worried about is that I'm not really able to, as yet, I mean, I need time to write about it in a more sociological sense. It's not yet distinguishable from, or sort of sharply distinguishable from, the work of journalists or other people who are also engaged in this issue. So I think that while I do have things to say that would connect it to larger sociological debates, and I do want to look at not just the role of the state or the Maoists, but also the role of human rights activists and other people who do a kind of meta critique of all the actors in this debate, which include journalists and activists. As I said, I think once you take a public stand on something, it does close off your access to certain kinds of material, certain kinds of people who you can interact with. So for instance, I would find it hard to get interviews with people in government because they see me as the enemy. And I also find it hard to get in. I mean, I can't interview the Maoists because, again, I've been critical of them, and it would, I wouldn't have access in the way that somebody else would have, precisely because I'm seen as a Maoist by the government. So, it's all. So I think there are lots of ways in which my sociological research, which I would have, this kind of sociological research that I would have wanted to do if I hadn't been involved publicly, has been stymied. On the other hand, I have a lot of material which other people wouldn't have through my involvement in the court case. I have, personal interactions with officials of a kind that other people who haven't been engaged with it in this fashion wouldn't have. So I think now the challenge is to sort of work with what I have and produce a different kind of sociology based on this kind of ethnographic experience, which is, I think, what Michael's own kind of experience has been pretty inspiring on that, in terms of, using particular kinds of experiences to think about what sociology should be.
So we'd like to go ahead and just open up for discussion. I know we have a lot of student questions for you. And Malay?
Yeah. Hi.
Introduce yourself, Nandani.
Yes. I'm Malana. Wait for the camera. I was wondering, running off what you just said, how do you feel that your academic credibility is strengthened or weakened by your use of public sociology?
Should we repeat that question for you, Nandini?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay, and
some
if we could
disturbance.
just raise our voices so she can hear us.
I am Malana. I was wondering how you felt your academic credibility was weakened or strengthened by your use of public sociology.
Well, I think certainly the government would, or people who I've been critiquing would like, particularly, in the security establishment, would like to try and dismiss me as an activist who is somehow biased, etc., and therefore lacking in objective academic credibility. But I don't think that among the sociological community, I would face that problem. And at least I'm hoping that sociologists are, I don't think that actually that is going to be a problem in addressing a sociological community, because the kind of work that lots of other people are also doing work on similar issues like surveillance and terrorism and counterinsurgency. So, but I think in terms of the larger public, it is always an issue. And one of the things that I have tried to do is kind of keep it quite separate from my teaching and administrative work. And because I'm also chair of my department, I have the sort of legitimacy of being part of the establishment right now. So, I'm trying to kind of juggle these different kinds of persona.
And then this is actually one of the questions that we've been discussing a lot is the relationship between different kinds of sociologies or sociological knowledges and the ways in which sometimes they can actually support each other and sometimes the ways that they can constrain each other. Do we have other questions? So Andrew, right over here.
Hi, I'm Andrew. So my question is, well, in some of the pieces we had to read, you talked about how the state or state repression has influence over what's talked about in the media. And so I was wondering if, so in your public sociology, have you been able to use mass media to like disseminate your findings, or have you used alternative means to do that?
Oh, I think we've lost our sound for a minute. Can you hear us, Nandini?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me now?
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry, we had
Yeah.
a momentary audio problem. So maybe Andrew can repeat his question for you?
Okay.
I heard his question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I have tried to use the mass media, but there's always a difference between what you write in opinion pages and what gets covered as news. And the news is always much more effective in disseminating a point of view because opinion pieces or op-ed pieces are by their nature limited. So even though there have been critical articles, articles critical of the government's counter-insurgency policy, most of the coverage of this issue is through the news, and all the news that gets reported is Maoist killings, Maoist attacks. There's very little on government violations of human rights. So that's something that's structurally built into the way the media is set up. That the police are the kind of what Stuart Hall described as the police being the primary definer of news. So you have large organizations like the government, like the police, which are much more effective at getting their viewpoint across than activists or even social movements who are by nature structurally weaker. So I've tried, but I haven't been that successful at. I've written a lot, but again, getting published is also difficult in.
So Nandini, can I actually ask you, because now you've brought. You're still here. You can see us, yes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So, you actually now you brought up two different examples of ways in which you've attempted to address these issues. One through the Supreme Court case, which you laid out for us, that even after years of working on that case and winning that case, that the state was essentially able to overturn it. And another avenue of resistance through kind of media and the ways in which actually, for the most part, media is the messages that are communicated by the media are shaped by the state. And so where does that leave you right now in terms of where you see as possibilities for addressing these things, given how we've just characterized, a judicial approach and a media approach?
Well, I think that leaves me with a sociological approach. What I really want to do is write about it in depth and address all the issues that I haven't been able to address through the media and through the courts, because in the courts, for instance, we've had to say things that I would normally cringe at saying as an anthropologist or as a sociologist, how poor Adivasis are caught between the state, they have no agency there, which, as a sociologist, this is not something that you would subscribe to. So, the documents for the court have to be prepared in a particular kind of language and focusing on legal violations. What's said through the media, again, has to take a particular point of view in relationship to something that's happened currently. So it doesn't allow for that sort of larger long-term analysis that I'd want to do as a sociologist. So really right now I want to concentrate on writing my book on this whole subject, looking at questions of democracy in India, sovereignty, authority and legitimacy and so on.
We look forward to being able to read that.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth, and I wanted to know what are the relative advantages of working within and outside the law, especially in a situation where neither really seems to yield any results in terms of justice?
Did you hear that, Nandini?
There's a lot. Could you repeat that, please?
Yes. My question was, what are the relative advantages of working within and outside the law when neither of those options seem to yield any results in forms of justice?
What are the advantages of working outside the law or with the law?
Within and outside the law, the relative advantages?
Sorry, I can't hear that. I couldn't.
So, yeah, I'll try and just say it really loudly so that we make sure that you can hear us. So, Liz is asking, what are the relative advantages and disadvantages of forms of resistance inside the law and outside of the law, given what you've kind of laid out for us?
That's something that I keep asking myself because if you are engaged in litigation, for instance, it requires a certain kind of discipline in what you say and a certain kind of thing which perhaps given the fact that it may not be that productive and it could actually backfire, because there was always the danger that this, if we had a right-wing court, then they might have legitimized the counter-insurgency and vigilantism. And on the other hand, so there have been lots of, activist voices being raised about the issue, and it's hard to say, whether engaging with the state or the judiciary is more productive. And I think they really have to go together, that you need a larger political movement to make the courts and the government work, and you also need pressure on the state through the judiciary in order for the movements to have something to build upon.
So, Kaylee, right here.
Hi, I'm Kaylee. I'm curious about your relationship with the Adivasis and whether or not you constitute them as one of your publics.
Whether or not?
Whether or not you constitute them as one of your publics.
The people of Chhattisgarh.
Yeah, absolutely.
How do you do that?
Except, it's a different, I guess I treat them as part of my public in the sense of not the way that I would treat other publics who can access what I write, but they're certainly public in the sense that when I have given public, talked at mass rallies, they have been part of the public. That's the public that I'm addressing, telling them about what's happening with the court case. There was a huge rally or a public meeting in November last year, soon after the court case, where we were sort of discussing what happened, but also at a more kind of intimate level with the people that I know well in the village that I've been working in visiting for the last 20 years. They're my interlocutors. I discuss with them, whether it's right for me to do the things that I'm doing, whether there should be a different approach. So in that sense, they're not public in the sense of being a distant public who you don't know on a face-to-face level, but they're part of the public in the sense of people that I interact with, that I address my engagement to.
Daveen had a question also?
Hi, I'm Nandini. You depict the situation of violence and repression that's happening on a state level and on a local level. And I was wondering, how do you go about doing your work or working with the community in such a tension or high tension environment?
It's very hard to even maintain one's old friendships, because in the last few years, I've followed everywhere that I go. I've been basically abducted from my field village by special police officers. I get surrounded, and it's followed by 50 policemen, and so it's very hard to talk to people that I've known, because you can't talk to anybody if you're surrounded by 50 policemen who are following you around everywhere. So my phones are tapped, on a routine basis, even in Delhi. It is hard. I mean, it's hard to not just do sociological research, but just to continue with the kind of everyday relationships that one has in the field. But I don't know, it's fairly minor compared to all the horrible things that happen to other people. So it's okay.
So, and I think we have another question right here from Min.
I just wanted to follow up. So in light of these challenges to your modes of communication, how do you find other avenues of getting your ideas out?
Well, I guess through the internet, through listservs, through particular communities who are engaged in these issues or interested in this area. The media, I used to do more television interviews earlier, when I was kind of desperate to get my point of view across, and nobody was, the media just wasn't taking it up. And so at that point, whenever they had a discussion on Maoism, I'd agree to go. The media also calls you if you get identified with a particular issue, then you begin to get called to, chat shows on that issue. So, but after, in the last year or so, I think the issue has become public enough for me not to have to kind of keep intervening. So, I'm happy not to be part of the media in that sense, in the television sense, because it's very restrictive, because TV wants to set you up as either this or that. They always have these balanced shows where they have pro and anti people. And if you don't want to be slotted as either pro or anti, and you want to have a completely independent view, then it's a bit lacerating and soul destroying to be part of television programs. So in a way, I'm happy not to have that medium now, or not to engage in that medium, but I do want to keep writing about these issues.
We've got Diana right here next to Min. Diana, maybe if you start speaking, then our camera person will know who she's looking for. Great, thank you.
I'm Diana, and first I want to applaud you in the work that you do, because you're very brave. But I wanted to ask you, what do the Adivasi people that you work with, what do they expect from you, and how do you gain their trust?
Could you hear that, Nandini?
What people expect from me, what Adivasis expect?
Yeah, what are their expectations when you work with them? Do they see you as somebody that's going to fix the issue, as somebody that's going to write about it and get their word out, or what are their expectations of your work?
Well, Adivasis in general, I think for a long time didn't know about, my work, because what was happening in the court was fairly remote from their everyday life. Here people were basically fleeing for their lives, and so it wasn't unlike a normal situation where you have a movement and you have somebody engaged in advocacy on behalf of that movement, and people in the movement know. Here it was a completely different kind of situation. So initially, when I started collecting testimonies, etc., people were scared to talk. So it wasn't like they were expecting anything out of me, or they were expecting, or that they saw me as anything other than, just somebody who was asking them. So I think now, because the judgment has become known, people probably want me to kind of at least continue with the court work. But again, there's a complete dichotomy between the reading public, the public outside this area, which knows what is happening with the court, and the public in the affected area itself, which is completely cut off from all communications. So I don't think actually anybody knows about me or cares about me. So I don't think it really matters.
So we've got Julian over here.
Hello, I'm Julian, and you talk a lot about how the police follows you around everywhere, and I was just wondering if they ever identified people that you've spoken to and then repress those people later on, or have they been subject to violence because you've spoken to them?
Yeah, which is why when I was being followed around, I didn't speak to anybody. I just came back home because there would have been no point subjecting anybody to, the danger of future retribution. But that's something that I'm constantly worried about. If you take people's testimonies to court, what if that gets used against them? Because everything that we submit to the court goes to the other side as well. So, yeah, that's a worry that I live with. That rather than helping people, that I might actually be harming them through exposing them through the court. But on the other hand, people are incredibly brave, and they know that they give their testimonies out of choice as well. So they know that they could suffer, but they've already suffered so much that they really want to just talk about it. They want justice. So I'm just counting on people's bravery, really.
We have time maybe for one or two more questions, for a couple more. So we have Naomi right here next to me, and then Michelle afterwards.
Hi, my name is Naomi. You said that you have not written for sociological audience, and I thought that was really important given that we're talking about public sociology and that there's a distinction between the professional and the general audience. Who do you identify as this wider audience? Is this the international community? Is this local communities? What kind of audience are you looking to come across, like get your information to, or the expectations of it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, we're here.
Everybody, I guess, anybody who's concerned with this issue. So the Indian public at large, the newspaper reading public, the international community, people who are concerned. So I've written documents sort of outlining the situation for international bodies as well as, part of human rights briefs. The security community to try and convince them that their approach is wrong, people in government to criticize what they're doing, activists to, let them know what's happening and try and get to mobilize people. The Maoists, we've written open letters to the Maoists saying, why do you inflict the death penalty on people when you're opposed to the death penalty by the state? So, all sorts, so a whole variety of different publics, and also sociologists and, but the way that I would write about these issues for sociologists would be somewhat different. It's not about trying to convince people of how terrible things are, because I don't think, sociologists would need convincing in that fashion. But so different kinds of things for different kinds of audiences. So again,
and then,
it depends.
Nandini, we have one last question for you from Michelle.
Hi, I'm Michelle. You referred to this dialectical relationship between the Maoists and the state and similar behavior. What would it require for the Maoists to break away from this relationship, and how likely is that?
Well, what it would require is for both sides to agree to peace talks. I think the Maoists are kind of more ready at the moment for peace talks than the government is. But what it would require is for both sides to declare a ceasefire, for the Maoists to realize that they're not, going to be able to gain control in the Indian state as a whole, and negotiate for the people they work amongst, because the Indian state is just far too powerful militarily and economically for the Maoists. But I think really the Indian state has to take the first step, and it has because they have to initiate the peace talks. So that's something that we've been campaigning for as well, that there should be peace talks. And I've been part of different platforms that have tried to make this issue public. So I think that's what it would take, peace talks, really.
Nandini, unfortunately our time is running short, but we're very, very appreciative of you taking the time, especially in the middle of the night in Delhi, to be with us. And you've raised all kinds of really important issues for us I'm sure we're going to continue to talk about. And actually next week, we're being joined by Cesar Garavito Rodriguez, who is going to be talking about some very similar issues. He also works with indigenous communities and their struggles around land and resources, but in Latin America now. So we thank you for being here and with helping us set this off. Thank you so much.